The barn had always been my sanctuary, a refuge where I escaped the cold, grey hands of loneliness, a haven filled with the scent of hay. Far from the city, that small wooden structure with its time-worn walls felt like a home that warmed my soul. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the silence wrapped around me as if the world paused. That is, until one night when an innocent moment spiraled into something strange and dark. Looking back now, I ask myself, what is trust, really? Where do boundaries begin and end? How much do we truly understand or accept about the hidden, tangled desires within us? I know it sounds odd, maybe even a little unhinged, but I swear, it all started so innocently, or at least that's what I convinced myself of at first. People are masters at self-deception, aren't they? You look in the mirror, say, nothing's wrong, and miss the lie staring right back at you. That's what I did. Until that night. That night, in the dim corner of the barn, I faced the most unexpected turning point of my life and had to rebuild myself from scratch. My husband was off on another business trip, as usual. The house felt empty, its silence pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Those big rooms, the familiar things. The teapot sitting quietly in the corner, the furniture giving off a dusty calm, the TV screen staring blankly, suddenly felt foreign. I brewed tea, but it didn't warm me inside. I'd turn on the TV, but its sound couldn't fill the void. That hollow feeling, that restless itch I couldn't name. It was like there was a hole in my heart, and I had no idea how to fix it. Sometimes I'd stare out the window, asking myself, why do I feel this way? But no answer came. Mornings, I'd get up, prepare breakfast, then sit on the porch. But as the teacup cooled in my hands, my mind drifted elsewhere. I'd mutter to myself, am I missing something? Or am I just overthinking this? Yet, that unease kept growing. Desperate for a way out, I found myself in the barn, like I always did. Apollo was there, a magnificent chestnut gelding, a constant in our lives, calm and graceful. His eyes were so deep, so peaceful, they could carry you off to another world. That evening I felt something strange inside, but I couldn't figure it out. Maybe I didn't want to. And that night, under the barn's faint lights, I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. Oh, what a line it was. Sit tight, grab your tea, and let me tell you, it's a long story. Our marriage, well, how do I put it? It was like tea and a bagel. Simple, routine, but cozy in its own way. Not the grand, passionate love story I dreamed of in my youth. Perhaps, but it was comfortable, familiar, reliable. He worked at a big company, meetings, business dinners, trips. His life seemed to revolve around it all. He'd leave early in the morning, sometimes gone for weeks. I'll be back this week for sure, he'd say. But that week would turn into a month. He'd call, work's dragging on. Sometimes I'd tease, you'd better answer to me when you get back. And he'd laugh, my ledger's ready for you. That was it. Meanwhile, I was at home, watering the garden, fussing with flowers, cooking, dozing off in front of the TV. I'd chuckle to myself sometimes. I used to write poetry, now I'm peeling potatoes. What a downgrade. But I didn't complain. This life gave me structure, a home. I'd wake up, make breakfast, set a nice table if he was there. If not, I'd whip up some toast, grab my tea, and sit on the porch. I'd look at the garden flowers and think, at least you're here. I'd talk to myself sometimes. These flowers are happier than I am. Still, something felt off. A void growing quietly inside me. I couldn't name it, but I felt it. Like my soul was searching for something it didn't know. That's when Apollo began to fill that gap, step by step, without me even realizing it, flowing in like a river, blooming like a spring branch. We had a piece of land just outside town, a little slice of heaven away from the concrete jungle and its endless noise. The barn was spotless, its wooden walls marked by years. Every time I opened the door, that familiar creak welcomed me, and the smell of hay rushed into my lungs. That scent took me back to my childhood, summers at my grandma's, running through her hayloft. I'd say, when I grow up, I'll build a house here, and she'd laugh, clean up this hay first. Thinking of those days now twists my heart. What innocent times they were. The field stretched out endlessly. Watching the grass dance in the breeze was pure calm, especially at sunset when the sky turned golden and pink. I'd watch from the porch sometimes, thinking, this beauty makes everything worth it. My husband loved horses. That's part of why we got the place. Back when we were young, he'd say, starry-eyed, someday we'll have a ranch full of horses. It came true, but for him, they were just a hobby, a way to unwind on weekends. The city fries my head. This is my cure, he'd say. Take a quick ride, then head inside. But I formed a different bond with them, especially Apollo. When he was away, I'd visit the barn often, feeding them, brushing them, or just sitting there. That stillness, so far from the city's chaos, felt like rediscovering myself. The barn was like the only place that took me as I was. No judgment, no questions, just listening. Hours would pass there, sometimes without me noticing. I'd sit in the field at dusk thinking, I wish I could stay here forever. The wind would brush my hair, nudging me like, get up. You've got things to do, but I'd linger, lost in thought. I remember my first solo visit to Apollo like it was yesterday. The air was crisp, the sweet scent of fall soaking into every corner of the barn. Hay, fresh grass, a touch of earth. It hit my nose and opened me up, like my lungs were tasting air they'd forgotten. Apollo stood there, watching me. His chestnut coat gleamed as sunlight poured through the window, like he'd stepped out of a painting or an old movie hero. Those deep brown eyes, so calm, so wise, seemed to know me like he'd been waiting for years. Hey, big guy, I said softly, my voice trembling. I don't know why, but I wanted to speak to him. Maybe I needed to share that loneliness inside me, or maybe I just wanted comfort. He dipped his head, sniffing the air, as if he understood. Something passed between us, a trust I couldn't put into words. Maybe it was all in my head, but it felt real, touching something deep within, sparking a little flutter. My shaky hand reached out, brushing his coat, soft, warm, alive. This horse knows me better than I do, I thought, smiling. Sometimes I'd wonder, am I really this lonely? But with Apollo, that question faded away. Days went by, and as my husband's trips stretched longer, I spent more time with Apollo. At first, it was all innocent, truly. I'd brush him, clean his hooves, or just sit there in silence. Every moment with him chipped away at that restless ache inside. Sometimes I'd rest my hand on his neck and think, talking to you is so easy. With my husband, words got stuck in my throat, but with Apollo, silence was enough. One day, I decided to ride him. My aunt used to say, sometimes your heart wants something for no reason. And that day, I felt it. A strange, unexplainable urge. I saddled him up and rode out into the field. The wind whipped my face, his strong strides setting me free. It was like the world stopped. Just us. I wish every day could be like this, I thought. His rhythm, the wind's hum, it swept me to another place. Even back home, that feeling clung to me, a goofy grin on my face, a weird peace in my heart, like I'd stepped back into my youth. That night in bed, I thought, this horse is more in my life than I am, laughing to myself. I'd want to tell my husband I miss Apollo, but I'd bite my tongue. He'd think I'm nuts. But one evening, everything changed. I'd ridden him that day and brought him back to the barn. Normally I'd finish up and head home, but I didn't want to leave. As I groomed him, my hand lingered on his coat, and I felt a warmth, a strange closeness. Apollo didn't pull away. He leaned into me. That's when I realized this wasn't just a bond between a horse and a person. It was more. I'm being ridiculous, I muttered, hands still on his coat. It's the loneliness. I'm losing it. But that feeling grew, and I couldn't stop it. As my hand moved along his neck, I felt his breath, calm yet strong. My heart raced, and I didn't know why. But something pulled me closer. Hold on, I told myself. What is this? But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then it hit me. Apollo's presence wasn't just calming me. It was waking something up. Something I couldn't name. Something I tried to push down. His warmth seeped into me as I brushed him, like he was calling. Come closer. I thought, he's a horse. What am I doing? But that inner voice wouldn't hush. Even when my husband was home, something was missing. I couldn't talk to him. He didn't get my silences. We'd sit at dinner, him scrolling his phone, me fiddling with my fork. How was your day? I'd ask. Fine, he'd grunt. Once I teased, say amazing for a change. But he just nodded. No smile. With Apollo, though, I didn't need words. He saw me with those eyes. One night, I couldn't stand it. I went to the barn. It was dark, moonlight slipping through the cracks, coating everything in silver. Apollo stood there, like he'd been waiting. My heart pounded, unexplained. I touched his neck, and he leaned in. The world went quiet, just us. His breath brushed me, and a wave rose inside. My pulse racing. What's this? I asked myself, but I didn't stop. I looked into his deep brown eyes, and it was like he saw me. The real me. No masks, no lies. Then I froze. What's happening to me? I wondered. I pulled back, heart in my throat. This is wrong, I thought. But that fire inside didn't fade. It roared. I couldn't sleep that night. My husband snored beside me while I stared out at the barn. Apollo's shadow danced in my mind, calling me back. You're losing it, I told myself. But my heart said otherwise. Go back, don't stop. I tossed and turned, asking, what is this feeling? With no answers. It was a beginning. As his trips dragged on, the barn became a need, not a habit. Apollo wasn't just a horse anymore. He was my secret, my escape, my obsession. With him, I felt alive. At home, I was a shadow. Even when my husband came back, my thoughts stayed with Apollo. His gleaming coat, his graceful moves, the depth in his gaze. Enough! I'd scold myself in the mirror, snap out of it. But it was useless. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Sometimes I'd laugh. I used to read novels. Now I'm living one with a horse. But that joke couldn't calm the chaos inside. It just patched it up, like a band-aid. I'd stare in the mirror and ask, when did you become this? But the mirror stayed silent, like my husband. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The longer his trips, the more time I spent with Apollo. It wasn't just grooming or riding anymore. I talked to him. Yes, it sounds nuts, but I'd spill my troubles. My husband doesn't get me, Apollo. I'd say, and he'd tilt his head like he was listening. I'd chuckle. Look at me, doing therapy with a horse. No shrink bills. But those moments felt so good. I didn't care if anyone understood. His calm, those non-judgmental eyes, accepted me as I was. Evenings with my husband became torture. He'd watch TV, and I'd silently chant Apollo's name. Once at dinner, I zoned out. He asked, "You okay?" And I blurted, "Apollo's fine." He stared. "What?" I stammered. "Nothing." I spaced out, cursing myself inside. "Idiot, watch it." That's when I knew. Apollo wasn't just a horse. He was part of me, a missing piece of my soul. One day in the barn, it was cold, my hands chilled, but Apollo melted it all away. I touched him, trembling. Not from fear, but excitement. My hand ran over his coat, and he pressed closer. My heart pounded, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I realized this wasn't just peace or friendship. A fire burned inside, growing despite my efforts to smother it. His breath hit my neck, sending a wave through me. "What's this?" I asked myself, too scared to seek an answer. His warmth pulled me in as my hand lingered. "This is wrong," I said, but a voice whispered, "Keep going." I lost myself, swept up in him. His breath, his soft coat, his gaze. The world stopped, just us. Is this a dream? I wondered, but no, it was too real, shaking me to my core. I'd ask myself, is this normal? Then shrug, normal or not, who cares? After that night, everything shifted. When my husband came home, I wasn't the same. I'd drift off cooking, half answering his questions. "Something wrong?" he'd ask. "No, I'm fine," I'd say, but my voice gave me away. He noticed, but didn't know what. I did. Every moment with Apollo pulled me further from my home, my husband, my old life. Worst of all, I didn't want to escape it. I'd look in the mirror, asking, "Who are you now?" No answer, just Apollo's eyes in my mind. He was reshaping me. The calm, orderly woman I knew was gone, replaced by someone new. Time with my husband felt heavy. I'd feel guilt looking at him, but freedom with Apollo. At night, I'd lie beside him thinking, if only he understood me like Apollo, then laugh. Idiot, comparing a man to a horse. One evening, he came home early. I was in the barn, lost in another moment with Apollo. My hand roamed his neck. He leaned in. The world paused, just us. Then footsteps. I jolted back, heart racing. "Who's that?" I thought, but Apollo stayed calm. The door creaked. His voice. I knew something was off. His meeting had cancelled. My hands froze. I couldn't look at him. He stood there, staring. "What's this?" he asked, voice cold but cracking. "Nothing," I said, trembling. "I see now," he said, eyes flicking to Apollo. "Then me." "I didn't mean for this," I whispered. But it wasn't a lie. I hadn't. It just happened. That moment, it all collapsed. His hurt eyes cut through me, but Apollo's pull held firm. I didn't know what to do. My marriage, my life, shattered. He said nothing more, just went inside. I stayed in the barn with Apollo. His steady breath, those deep eyes. He didn't judge, he understood. But inside me, a war raged. Guilt, shame, yet that odd peace. Who am I now? I asked. No reply. From then on, everything changed. The gap with my husband widened. We stopped talking. He knew something, but not what. I knew it all. Apollo had made me someone else. The old me was gone. In bed, I'd think, if I could take it back, but Apollo's eyes would flash, and I'd think, no, I wouldn't. But the story didn't end. My bond with Apollo deepened. Even with my husband home, I'd sneak to the barn with excuses. Need air, I'd say, hiding the storm within. Apollo was always there, his calm eyes and warm presence waiting. Touching him hushed the world. Just us. This is wrong, I'd mutter, but my heart sang otherwise. Lying next to my sleeping husband, I'd close my eyes and see Apollo, his coat, his breath, his look. It felt dreamlike yet so real, stirring me inside. I'd wonder, is this love or madness? But never searched for an answer. I was afraid of it. One day, he faced me, serious. "What's wrong?" he asked, probing my eyes. Hiding something. My heart nearly stopped. "No," I said, unconvincing. "Don't treat me like a fool," he snapped, then left. I knew it couldn't last. But abandon Apollo? Unthinkable. A battle raged inside, and Apollo always won. He drew me in deeper. Time with my husband weighed on me like a burden. I'd look at Apollo and think, smiling, "This is your fault." But it wasn't, it was mine. I'd let it happen. I'd chosen this path. Then that day came. He left for a meeting. I bolted to the barn. Apollo was there, as ever. I touched him, trembling but resolute. My hand slid over his coat. He leaned in. I realized this wasn't just escape, it was my truth. Then I heard his car. He was back early. Panic struck, but too late. The door opened. "So, this is it," he said, voice quaking. "This is your choice?" I couldn't look up. "I didn't know," I said. But it happened. That was it. Everything ended. He left. The house went still. I stayed with Apollo. But a void grew within. Guilt? Regret? Freedom? I didn't know. All I knew was I couldn't go back. Those moments with him had changed me forever. I had to learn to live as this new me. Every morning, I'd look out, Apollo waiting, and I'd go to him, because life without him wasn't an option. That fire inside never died. He warmed and burned me all at once. I'd chosen this blaze, walking a path with no return. Sitting in the field, I'd look at him and think, every moment with you saved and wrecked me. But I'd go to him anyway. He was my truth now.